This is Kareem from Open Source Defense, and I am here with Isaac Botkin of T.Rex Arms. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Kareem. I'm honored to be part of this podcast.
Well, I'm honored to have you. Well, just by way of context, I have described you a couple times in the Open Source Defense newsletter as the Lucius Fox of GunTube.
Yes.
But in your own words, what do you do at T.Rex?
Well, Mr. Wayne, I work on R&D. No, I think that's a very flattering description, but it implies a great deal of knowledge, wisdom, and experience. And I feel like I'm only beginning to attain to the lower foothills of those things. I would consider myself to be more, I can't think of a great example, but way more experimental than Lucius Fox. Lucius Fox is a man who has mastered things. I am somebody who is dipping my toe into stuff. And one of the great things about T.Rex Arms is, since it is a small business, it's relatively young, I've been able to dip my toe into a lot of stuff that I saw from afar when I worked for other people. When it's your own company, you're the only person who can do certain jobs. So you wear all the hats and you get to put your fingers in all the pies and dip your toe into all kinds of new stuff. So I'd consider myself a very experimental, nutty professor, scientist, not a Lucius Fox, but I am flattered.
Okay, well, we will dig into that. T.Rex has been around for 11 years now. Is that right?
Just about, yeah. I think almost exactly.
Okay. What are the milestones that made you realize it was going to be a real business?
So at the very beginning, it was Lucas Botkin making. It wasn't even holsters. He started off with mag carriers made out of Kydex, and it involved heating the Kydex in a toaster oven, which we still have, cutting the Kydex with X-Acto knives, which is very dangerous. That should not, scoring and cutting Kydex with X-Acto knives is very dangerous. Should not be attempted. As the first things began to sell on eBay, and Lucas began to post videos demonstrating the products on Instagram, I thought it was very cool, but it wasn't until we'd moved a long ways from that. We had our own website probably a few months after that. And I say I was helping from the sides. I wasn't a full-time person. I was pretty much at that point just I made website stuff and logos and things like that. That was my main bread and butter, was graphic design and video production. So I was helping here and there Lucas with stuff, but it wasn't until I think it was the first Black Friday we experienced, and I needed to help make holsters during Black Friday. I was like, oh, this might actually go somewhere. And I think it was 3 years in that I quit my freelance graphics job to come work at T.Rex full time. And the first thing that I worked on was automation, CNC cutting of holsters, because it was obvious at that point that we needed to have automation. Human beings couldn't really handcraft holsters and keep up with the demand that we saw. So it was right around there, 8 or 9 years ago, when that became really obvious to me that this, we hired, I think, 4 or 5 people by then, and we still couldn't keep up. It was like, oh, this is a train that is moving.
Yeah. What was the production process at the 3-year mark right before you switched to CNC?
Well, the good news is we had switched away from X-Acto knives and the microwave oven or the toaster ovens. We were now using T-shirt presses, so squashing the thin sheets of Kydex between two hot plates, essentially. That was a much better way to heat Kydex. It was much more consistent. But then after the holster was formed around a blue gun and squashed in between some foam, 2 pieces of foam, we had to leave it in there to cool for like 10 or 15 minutes because the foam is just such a good insulator. The heat just stayed. So we had a whole floor full of these presses, and you had to kind of keep track of, you'd go from one press to the other putting hot Kydex in, and then 15 minutes later come back and start taking them out and keep this large rotation going. And then every holster was hand crafted. It was cut on a bandsaw, and we had patterns, but some of the guys who are really good at their jobs could freehand holsters, drill holes for the hardware with a drill press, cut on a bandsaw. buffing on a little buffing wheel, and then assemble the holster with the final hardware. So we would have belt clips and just the adjustment hardware for the holster. And those last two steps, the buffing and the hardware, haven't actually changed that much, but the forming changed drastically. As soon as we could cut forms that we could vacuum form on, we started vacuum forming holsters. And as soon as we had the CNC machines to cut the molds, we would also cut the holsters on those same CNC machines. So CNC machine would drill the holes, CNC machine would cut the outline of the holster out. It was an incredible step. Everything sped up. Everything got more precise and more repeatable at that point. Once we figured out what we were doing, of course.
So is it that like the vacuum forming versus pressing, the advantage of the vacuum forming is you don't have to, basically the turnaround time, not waiting for the Kydex to cool as long?
That's a huge part of it. The other thing is the vacuum, you just get better definition. You can pull the Kydex into the nooks and crannies of the mold. You can better get the shape of the holster. But the fact that it cools faster is huge. And the fact that you can see the Kydex means that now we have IR thermometers looking down at the Kydex. We can watch the temperature of the Kydex. We can know if it's hot enough to pull the vacuum or if it should be put back in the heater. We can also see if it's cooling too fast or too slow, if the mold's getting too hot. So we have just a lot more eyes on the process when we vacuum form, as opposed to putting it inside of a big foam sandwich and just like hope that a good holster comes out after 15 minutes.
Maybe if you can give kind of like a holster making 201, when, if ever, does it make sense to switch to injection molding versus Kydex?
Oh, this is a very complicated question. So injection molding is fantastic for high volume parts, and vacuum forming is fantastic for low volume parts. So we do make some injection molded pieces, some of the tuckable clips, the Raptor Claw. There are things that we have injection molded because they are either A, super high volume parts, or we want a specific material characteristic that you cannot get from thermoforming material. So Kydex is the thermoforming material we make out of the holsters out of. That is a great material for rapid thermoforming, but it doesn't make the best long-term, high tensile strength, fatigue resistant material for a belt loop or a belt clip. An injection, an injection molded part that is a nylon with some glass in it, or nylon with rubber in it, some kind of impact modifier. You can really get good material characteristics out of stuff that you can injection mold at hundreds and hundreds of degrees compared to the Kydex. But what's great about the Kydex is we can vacuum form that at 300 to 350 degrees, which means that we can mold it directly against plastic. So we get to cut plastic molds to vacuum form against. Technically, I think they're called bucks in the vacuum forming lingo. And that is just much more affordable to make, faster to do revisions, easier to put on the shelf. Human beings can pick those up and move those around. They're just so much lighter if we make them out of high density polyethylene as opposed to steel or aluminum. If we were injection molding holsters, we would need a steel mold. We'd need two of them because we'd have to injection mold a positive and a negative. And so we could pump holsters out, but they'd all be the exact same shape and size. And we have something like 50,000 different holster variations in terms of geometry. And because we vacuum form different colors of Kydex, we end up with way more variations of what you can actually order and customize on the website. So there's also a consistency. We're probably approaching the point where it would be cost effective for us to make a mold for a Glock TLR7 right-handed sidecar. But we would prefer that our Glock right-handed TLR7 sidecar feel the same as our left-handed Glock TLR7 sidecar, the same as our CZ P10 X300 sidecar, our HK VP9, some of the less common holsters we would still vacuum form. And we would like consistency across the line to know that the fit and finish is the same, the adjustability is the same, all the characteristics of the holsters are the same, the color options are the same. you get exactly what you expect, regardless of whether you order a high volume, extremely common configuration or something that, H&K VP9 with a TLR1 in mint green. This is, 3 people order that a year, maybe.
Okay. Jumping back to the early years, what were the hardest parts of those first 3 or 4 years, kind of key inflection points?
So I would categorize the problems that we had to solve in 2 categories. The first set of problems were the obvious manufacturing ones, where we wanted to improve the quality of the product, and we would experiment with different things. So the very first holsters, we would buy blue guns off the shelf, which are cast in a urethane, I believe, and then we would just tape popsicle sticks to them with blue painter's tape, like literal popsicle sticks. But that doesn't last very long, and you're limited in popsicle you're limited in your popsicle stick shapes, and so we experimented with hand molding different types of epoxy onto the blue gun. So a lot of it was the problems that we were solving were not clear, finite problems. It was just looking for ways to improve the process, looking for ways to improve the product, and all of those I would put into a single bucket. The second set of problems we'd have to solve were business related. And a lot of those were really simple problems if we had known what we were doing. But at this point, we were hiring people that we knew well, but we didn't really know how to build layers of management within a company. So once you have a half a dozen people all making holsters, it's not that different than when you had one person making a holster. Once you have 24 people making holsters and doing R&D and various other things, you start to run into a need for meetings. You start to run into a need for basic business leadership problem solving stuff, which was a whole new set of experiences for us. At this point, I think T.Rex Arms is still Lucas's first actual real job. And I'd had a bunch of jobs as a freelance video guy. I'd worked for giant companies, and I'd seen kind of behind the corporate veil a bit, working for animation studios and film companies and things like that. My brother David had worked in IT and had worked at a newspaper and some other media companies. So we all had experience inside of companies, but we had never had key leadership roles where we were hiring, where we were firing, where we were setting corporate policy, where we were doing high levels of management. So all of these things were pretty new problems for us to solve as the company grew.
Did you all come in around that same time, like 3-ish years in?
It's actually far more complicated than that. So Lucas started making holsters, and I worked on his website. My brother Noah worked on his website. It was shortly after that the 2 Davids, David Botkin, my brother, and David Knorr, his brother-in-law, joined Lucas as partners. So for the first few years, it was a partnership of 3 people. And then I joined the company doing automation full-time and became the 4th owner. And so it was a little bit complicated moving from a partnership to a proper LLC. And at this point, there are still those 4 owners. We now have, at the time of this recording, 90 employees thereabouts. And we have a board, we have a CEO, and then we have a executive leadership team. Then we have essentially department heads. So we don't have quite as many layers of management as giant companies have, or even medium-sized companies have. We're still definitely in that small company territory, but it is the biggest company that I've ever been responsible for as an owner. It's the biggest company that any of us have ever been in direct management of, or on the C-suite of, or even in any level of management of.
Yeah. I think, so you alluded to something I've seen a bunch in startups, which is that, you get your first job as a company is making your product and making a good product and making something people want and all that. And then if you do a good job at that, you get this second job of being good at being a company. And the tricky part is, like, as many companies die for doing a bad job at that as for doing a bad job at making their core product, right?
Yes.
And the job changes, as you mentioned, right? Like, it's a kind of fundamentally different thing to have a 3-person company versus a 20-person company versus a 90-person company. So for you, what were the, from 1 person to 90 people, what were like the key triggers or events, those catalysts where you said like, okay, something has changed. We have some fundamentally new challenge, some new thing we need to do, and we need to kind of reform the company for this next phase of growth.
Yeah. So in some ways, the company growth was very natural. More customers would show up. They would buy more holsters. We would need more people to make holsters. Then as we started to realize that there were specific problems we wanted to solve, like we wanted to, there were at the beginning, 11 years ago, there were a lot of holsters for firearms. There were fewer holsters being made for firearms with weapon lights. So we knew that was an area, a need we specifically wanted to meet and to fill. As we emphasized holsters with weapon lights attached to firearms, we said, well, obviously it would be very convenient for our customers if we also sold the weapon lights themselves. So we started selling weapon lights. And then it was like, well, obviously it would help our customers if we sold the magazines for the pistols as well. So it grew very naturally for us to have different business silos within the company because just our customers would be served by this product. We would add it. And then we discovered that we had 2 business silos. We had a manufacturing silo and we had the sort of warehouse and fulfillment retail side of the house. I think that the key changes within the business, in one sense, it was all very slow, organic change, but occasionally, several times in the company, we've sat down and said, okay, so it no longer works for everybody to just talk to each other about what they're doing. We need to start having meetings. Then at another point, it was, it doesn't make sense for every single person in the company to be at every single meeting that the company holds. As we created management, decision makers, and employees, that felt like a pretty significant inflection point. When we had middle management, when there were people that came to meetings from a department, but I wasn't in the meeting with everybody all the way down the line, that felt like a pretty big change as well. And then most recently, we're coming up on a year now since we did this, having the owners, it's a little bit confusing because we all have jobs in the company, regular day jobs in the company, but the owners are no longer running the company as a quadumvirate. There is now a board that directs the CEO. The CEO gives jobs to the different department heads, some of whom may or may not also be the owners and board members. Like this was a massive change to the way that we'd run the company, and that's only about a year old. So I think every time there was a new layer of management or a new layer of communication, those feel like the big changes where you are, as your company grows, it becomes a different kind of company. Like as soon as we learned how to be a larva, it was time to be a pupa. And as soon as we learned how to be a pupa, it was time to be an adult crawling creature. And as soon as we got a handle on walking, it was time to be a winged creature. Like it's a whole new set of skills that you need to develop as a company.
Yes.
Someone else brought up the phrase that it's like every time you grow into your next stage of business, it is like breaking a bone so that it can heal properly in its new shape. And that is a deeply unpleasant analogy, but also more accurate than my bug one.
Okay. What bones did you break? What was for you? What were the hard parts of these inflection points?
So I've never thought of myself as a control freak, but when I have built a process and feel very invested in how the process is done, and then hand it off to somebody, that I have discovered that that's a lot harder for me than I thought that it was going to be. And part of it is I came out of a film and television background where you build a process for a movie or a TV show. And then when you're done with the process, you're also done with the show. It'll never be used again. Like you build a 3D animated character, you rig it for specific shots, and maybe it continues on for future episodes. But when you build a production pipeline, say for a holster line, like I did a huge amount of research and picked the shop bought CNC machines as the one that we would buy. Well, we've outgrown those machines, and I feel very sad that they're gone, even though the new machines are superior. I built systems that I put a lot of just time and effort into. And when I would train people to use them and they would come up with better ways of using the machine, it was honestly difficult for me to be happy for them. Be like, no, I didn't think of that. But what I thought of is something that still needs to be done. The handing off of things, delegation is one way to put it. But when you hand off a product or a process or a job to somebody to take in a different direction, that is more difficult for me than I thought that it would be. And so those were, each time that happened, it did feel a bit like a bone being broken, as it were. But every time those bones have healed. So a couple of years ago, I was running the engineering department and I was running holster development. And I have handed those jobs off to two people who are doing a better job at both of those jobs than I could do. So there is a tremendous gratitude that I have to those two guys. I'm impressed with what they're doing. It's fantastic, but I also miss the job a little bit. And then part of me, there's a little bit of personal pride where I'm like, man, that's such a better solution than the one that I made. So those are for me, those are the points. Handing things off that I enjoyed or took pride in have been difficult. And I always can tell what it is, because when people come along and do a worse job than me, it's a level of personal connection to the process. When they come along and they do a better job than me and I still feel a little sore, that's how I know that it was just pride.
How much of that is that trust that you build over time and being able to delegate to somebody and, ultimately letting go of like, okay, like they're ready to do this job. Is that a really good hiring process? Is it working with someone for a couple of years and promoting them from within? Like how much of it came from each of those?
This is a great question. So we talk about trust quite a bit, and there's a lot of different ways of, trust is often discussed in a business sense as a binary thing or a two-dimensional line. And trust is so much more complicated than that. Like, I trust my children very far in some areas and not so far in other areas. And some people define trust as when you completely let go. And sometimes trust is, I think Dave Ramsey has the trust is how much rope you give somebody, but you always are, if you are responsible for the company, you are still holding on to the rope. You never let go of the rope. The question is just how much rope. The fact that we have brought so many people in the company up and promoted from within, I think has been huge for trust. So the CEO that we have now is a guy that I hired to run a CNC machine. And this will sound very stupid, but when I first hired him to run that really simple CNC machine, I was like, boy, I don't know if he's going to be able to figure this out. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. This is a Navy fighter pilot. He can land an F-18 on a carrier at night. He's going to be able to run this CNC machine that has 3 buttons on it. It's going to be fine. So sometimes it was hiring people that you already knew them and what they were capable of. But a lot of that trust to give him control of the company as the CEO absolutely came from years of working together, giving him more responsibility, watching him manage other people. He went from being a guy making holsters under my management to managing all the people who made holsters while I did R&D stuff pretty quickly. Like, he demonstrated a high level of competence in managing people, which, again, you would expect this from a U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. Like, managing people is a thing that he has been doing, managing fighter wings, etc. So his credentials made it obvious that he could do the job. Watching him do the job built a huge amount of trust.
Yeah, and I'm sure, when you hired him, I'm sure you had somewhere in the back of your head that, okay, this guy's going to be on a steep growth trajectory.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Now, I was still like, boy, I hope he doesn't break my machine. And running this machine is completely beneath him. He should be flying fighter pilot around, war zones and making executive decisions at that level. So I simultaneously had I hope he can learn how to use this machine. And boy, this is such, he is slumming it doing this job.
I mean, the trust thing is super interesting because when I think of T-Rex, I think in some ways of like an old school family business.
Yeah.
And in other ways, obviously a very modern business. But it must have been maybe 6 months or a year ago. There was something on your YouTube channel where it was your dad and you and Lucas and I think David. And I forget even what the subject was, but I was just struck by, the children. You guys were, the way you were looking at your dad was with like a real kind of old school, just like respect, like you respect this man. And, you see that coming through, and also like everyone coming to join the business as it grows. So I'm curious kind of that transition from a like very closely held kind of traditional family business in some ways, transitioning into a business that is still family owned, but structurally more kind of, quote unquote, like typical, like board, hired
Sure.
CEO, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I still feel like we have a foot in both camps. And I'm deeply aware of the pros and cons of each model. Like there's tremendous value in hiring people that you've known for 10 or 15 years, and their character and their capabilities, and hiring them to do a thing that they've never done before, but they can learn to do it because their capabilities. That makes sense to me because we've done it, and the results have been great. But also looking at somebody that you've never met before, because you're hiring them to do a job that you've never thought about before, or your company has never needed before, like a financial analyst type position. And you talk to the person, and on paper, it's obvious they've been doing this job for other bigger companies very successfully. They have great references. Those kind of conversations or those kind of job interviews tend to pretty much focus on character and family and cultural fit, because on paper, that they can do the job. And again, oftentimes you're hiring them to do a job that you haven't had in the company before. It's not a thing that they could have gotten trained up to do from within. So there's value in both. There's value in both things tremendously, but there's also some tension that comes along with having both models within your company. There's going to be some tension between people who have been in the company for 15 years, and we just hired a brand new guy to do a really high level job. That can cause some tension, and it can be difficult, I think, for management as well to know how to walk that line when there's a person who knows the culture and the inner workings of the company intimately because he used to run one of the buffing wheels at the very beginning, and a guy who has come along who knows everything that there is to know about a specific complex technical academic field, but may not know the gun industry super well, and certainly doesn't know how T-Rex works. That I think is a management issue to figure out as well. But I do think that there needs to be a way where we get better at this. Not just T-Rex, but I think everybody. I think there needs to be a way for this to happen, because there is so much strength in both in both models. And as companies grow, I love new startups, and new startups can benefit and can flourish when you hire people who their character and their disciplines and their capability, and that they can just learn stuff. Like, it's I'm not patting myself on the back here, but it is far better that we hired me to figure out CNC machines from scratch and fit it to our existing company model and our existing product line than if we'd hired a professional machinist. Partly because we didn't know what we would have looked for, so the odds of us hiring the right guy would have been super slim. But also because solving all of those problems gave us a lot of insight into our product and our customers and our materials in a way that a guy who came from a different process or mentality might not have brought. The first engineer that we hired, we were providentially blessed to hire this guy. And I realize now what a rare bird he is. But he is a guy who is both a book smart engineer who's, got some aerospace experience, but also is a tinkerer who just makes things. That is, there are a lot of engineers who are one or the other of those things. And being able to hire our first engineer who is comfortable in both of those roles is really unique. But that's not a thing that we knew to ask for. That's not a thing that we knew to look for. So there was a tremendous value in us learning a bunch of lessons ourselves, kind of the hard way. There are lessons that come out of that are irreplaceable. Even if you could set up a dream team of pros and a fantastic chemical engineer who understands thermoplastics and so forth, if you got those three guys, a fantastic chemical engineer, a fantastic automation engineer, and then a fantastic shooter that understands pistols, and you put them in a room to try to develop products, I bet the products would be amazing. But it might not be the sort of thing that the market wants. It might not be the sort of thing that T.Rex customers want. And T.Rex is our customers. It isn't so much our current employees or our current product lines. As things have changed in the industry or in the market or with the materials, our products change because our customers need different stuff. So I am glad that we started off with people that we knew we could really trust to learn anything, because we didn't know what we needed to learn ahead of time. And I think that that's going to be true of lots of startups. But then you don't need to learn, business intelligence from scratch. There's people who have done that, and they will come from companies that have gone through similar things, or like leadership. One of a great leadership hire that we had a few years ago, who is the chief of operations right now, he is a guy who experienced incredible growth in the last company that he was in. And so when he joined us, we were doing this crazy rocket ride where we, I think, doubled the amount of employees in 2020, gone from, I think it was 30 to 60 employees in a single year. It was very difficult to do that. And when he came on board, he was like, oh yeah, my last company has doubled employees several times. We've seen year over year growth like this several years in a row. I've already been on this rocket. And that level of institutional knowledge and experience was huge. So if you can combine both of these things together at different stages of your companies, I think you are so much better off than you just pick a model. Learning how to deal with the slight tensions that come up between these different models. My tendency to say, like, well, I don't trust an expert because he's just an expert on paper. Like, has he actually done the thing? And then sometimes experts were like, well, I don't trust this guy over here because all he's done is build. We have an engineer now who doesn't have an engineering degree, but he has built so many amazing pieces of technology over the last 30 years of his career in different countries. On paper, he's not an engineer, but in real life, he's just incredible. So being able to get the best out of both sides is, I think, a really important thing that we've got to figure out, and not just build a single model to rely on.
What has been the hardest thing to hire for?
The hardest role, or the hardest character quality, or the hardest position, or hardest actual skill?
That's a good question. How about let's say
I'll tell you something that's hard to
hardest
ask
position,
about.
just kind of practically the hardest position.
Yeah. It's gotten easier as we've gotten bigger, because there are departments that are now multiple people. And so you're not hiring somebody who can fill multiple roles. You can hire someone who has a specific role and see what other skills they have. But things like R&D are difficult to hire for when you're a small shop, because you do need an engineer who, say, knows materials and knows tools and can make stuff himself. You need to have somebody who can run the software, but also has ideas. And later on, your R&D shop gets big enough, you can hire guys who are just genius draftsmen, and they don't have to be the best inventors. You can hire inventors who have crazy ideas, and maybe they can't run the Haas machine and make the tools themselves. At the very beginning, you really need to have people who are pretty comfortable with all of those things, and are comfortable wearing all the hats, and that's really tricky in my experience, because you can hire people who look like they're really good on paper have been involved in some amazing R&D startups. And then when they arrive, you realize they came from an R&D team of 80 people. And their job was proofreading prints. They didn't actually invent stuff. So I would say that the kind of intangible creative roles are the hardest to hire for, to figure out if the person has the kind of wonder and invention and creativity that is going to solve the problems that you're looking for. And are they going to be enough of a self-starter? Because a lot of times creative people need to be in the right environment. So those are kind of the hard ones, where you hire somebody and you get the sense like, man, if this guy were just in the right environment, I bet you he would be on fire. But I don't know what kind of environment that is, and I don't think our R&D shop is that.
Yeah. What do you do? So, some companies have a unfortunate habit of they'll like hire amazing people, creative people, and find that spark and then like snuff it out with internal processes or just not running the show well internally. After the hire, what are kind of like the key things you do to cultivate that spark and like bring the best out of the people that you have found?
So T.Rex has I think a secret weapon. T.Rex, for any of your listeners that don't know, T.Rex is a very ideologically focused company. So we don't just make holsters. We really want to equip people to protect themselves and protect others. So there's a strong mission that sits on top of the making the widgets and selling the widgets. And in some fields or some areas, this kind of ideological foundation, or it can be an unpleasant one politically. Widespread firearm ownership is frowned upon by certain segments of the American culture or population. We've been banned from certain websites, certain payment processors, etc. So like in some ways, by having this strong ideological focus, we have selected people who are passionate about the mission. And oftentimes they're passionate about the mission that if they come in and they work CS for a while because they love the equipment and the mission, but they realize that they don't actually like talking to customers. They've already sort of self-selected themselves as an ideal T.Rex person, and there's lots of other jobs in the company. So one of the things that does happen is a lot of times we bring people in and we put them straight onto production, or we put them straight into customer service, a little bit as a test, as an experiment to get familiar with T.Rex company processes and T.Rex customers and T.Rex products. But oftentimes, if they want to be a part of the T.Rex mission, there will be a place for that spark. The spark is what we like. And if it turns out they actually are not great emailing customers 8 hours a day, or they're not great running a machine 8 hours a day, but they want to be here for the mission, there will be something else that works for them. And so while a lot of companies talk about, don't have such an overt ideological mission, like make it something generic, like serving people, or something that is vague enough that you can have a big tent. There's value in that, but there's also value in being a little bit more overt, being a little bit more controversial, calling people to do a mission that is a little more specific. I think that is actually a huge, huge answer to your question. And it happens kind of automatically just because of what we want to do with T.Rex, not a specific like management trick that we figured out.
I think that's actually one of the things that stands out about the company, and really something that T.Rex pioneered in kind of the Instagram era of, or since the dawn of the Instagram era in kind of the gun social media space. This idea of like product, yes, but I want to say brand first, and I don't mean that I actually mean that in a really good way, not a disparaging way, in the sense that like a mission first company, and like here's our mission, and then here are the products that help us deliver on that mission, and here is also like the content and the education. It's that, inspire, educate, equip credo that you have. I'm curious that, like, I think in 2013 that was very unusual, right? And I think partly because of your success, it's less unusual now that, like, if you go on Instagram, there are companies with like great production values and kind of trying to be mission first. I'm curious how your strategy has changed in kind of delivering your own message as kind of that early, like, unexploited advantage has gone away and people have kind of woken up to, like, hey, customers want to hear about us on this stuff. How's your strategy changed as kind of the table stakes have changed in the industry?
Well, it's very kind of you to think that we have had a strategy this whole time, or that we've developed one now. In many ways, that was somewhat deliberate and somewhat accidental. A lot of the stuff that we did very deliberately on purpose, but we didn't deliberately make it part of our strategy. So there are certain things that we wanted to do with our marketing. In early 2013, we wanted to show, Lucas specifically had a desire to show actual shooting capability. So the product doesn't just look cool by itself. You actually show the product being used. And then he realized, it's actually really easy to fake competence if you speed up footage or if you use cutaways or if you edit too quickly. Let's actually demonstrate that not only is this product usable, but we are competent in using the product so that we can be trusted to tell you that its usability is at a high level. So a lot of times it was a very deliberate move to be more transparent, be more clear, be more honest, but it wasn't necessarily a large scale plan that was, if we do X, Y, and Z, we will have market differentiation from other people. But one of the things that has happened over time, and I don't think we can, T.Rex, take any credit for this. I think that there is a move that has happened over the last 10 years where boldness and courage are not only appreciated, but understood to be clear differentiators, to the point where 15 years ago, Jordan Peterson and Donald Trump, for example, are doing all the wrong things. Like, you're not supposed to ever say anything that would get you called out by the New York Times, And now we've discovered that being called out by the New York Times is actually really good for business, at least for a chunk of the population. And if you lean into controversy, if you lean into an uncomfortable sort of honesty in certain areas, there are people who appreciate that. And so in a way, I can see people in the gun community, for example, following T.Rex Arms in a little bit, I'd like to call it a no nonsense transparency approach, but sometimes it is just, I'm trying to come up with a nice way to say this. Like, we don't care that much what people think about us. And we know that has always been the essence of cool, to be yourself and not care about what other people think about you. And thinking very hard about how to be yourself the best way that you extract the most cool points out of it just kind of deflates the whole thing. But when you have principles that you really stick by, and you are a little bit of a fringe voice in places like Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, and places where firearm content is being squashed and firearm companies are trying to come up with workarounds to just lean into the offensive thing and be like, no, we're not going to pretend that these are sporting arms. We're not going to pretend that our pistols are just for practice. This is a self-defense tool. This is for actual protection of life. I think people really appreciated that in the same way that they appreciated some of these other countercultural voices speaking up. And I think that that's where a lot of the trend is coming from. And it wasn't something that we started. It's something that people have talked about for decades or centuries. But Jordan Peterson and Donald Trump and Elon Musk and lots of people who are iconoclastic to the point of being abrasive do attract an audience. And it's really interesting to watch that shift happen. And in some ways, I feel like there's a very good chance that T.Rex will kind of sit in the middle Like the pendulum will swing way past us, and there will be people who are way more shocking than T-Rex is, and we'll actually be thought of as the boring old moderates for a while. It's very possible. And as always, there won't just be one pendulum back and forth. There will be 50 pendulums moving across. The Twitter pendulum will be doing this, while the Facebook pendulum does that, and different markets will want different things on the same platforms. I predict great weirdness in the future, and one of the things that I think will differentiate us is if we don't change very much.
Yeah. This is actually, maybe this is a good place to ask you about the gun culture 1.0 versus 2.0 versus 3.0. I have a lot of questions about this, but where are we at? Are we gun culture 2.7 today? Where are we? What version of gun culture are we at today?
It's pretty fascinating. And again, I do think that in the past there were fewer pendulums, and now there's a bunch of them. In the past, there were every American owned guns or had owned guns in the past, or knew people who owned guns, and guns weren't that interesting. And that's part of the reason I think that gun control slowly became more the norm in the 1950s. Is guns were so common that there's no reason to have the National Firearms Association just has a cool magazine. They weren't a lobby group, a massive lobby group, because what would you lobby against? Everybody has a shotgun. Everybody well, what's the deal? And I think that as time has gone on, and we've seen lots of cultural and political changes through the 60s and the 70s, as there started to be a lot of more public talk and more public conflict over this in the 80s and the 90s, you started to see more fragmentation, where there's a lot more pendulums moving on a lot of different particular issues, and for different reasons. So the NRA and various other groups really doubled down on the sporting aspect of firearms, really wanted to appeal to hunters, really wanted to talk about our right to own guns, but not talk about the Second Amendment specifically, because the Second Amendment is pretty obviously not about hunting and target shooting. Make target shooting a thing that kids do to learn gun safety and as sport and for fun. And by doing that, they kind of left this large vacuum. And people like Jeff Cooper and other folks who wrote about firearms for self-defense and firearms for combat, and wrote, pretty unvarnished, brutal conversations about these are the bullets that are good for killing people, and that makes them better self-defense rounds than bullets that don't kill people. That was deeply offensive to the let's pretend like we're all just hunting people. And when we started to talk about firearms for self-defense, I think that is really where gun culture 2.0 kind of emerged. Gun culture 1.0 was, we hunt, and then of course we would shoot bad guys if there were any, but we live in Maine, there's no bad guys, we just duck hunt. And then gun culture 2.0 was, there are bad guys and guns are good to shoot them. And then gun culture 3.0 is probably where we talk about, hey, you know what the Second Amendment is good for? It's for overturning tyrannical governments. That's a far more offensive thing to certain people than just, self-defense and a carjacking or a mugging. And I think that's where gun culture 3.0 is on the ideological spectrum. Now, on the technology spectrum, I think gun culture 2.0 is we all own Glocks and AR-15s, and gun culture 3.0 is we're all okay with people 3D printing our own guns. Or maybe it's in a capability front, where gun culture 3.0 is where we all have body armor and night vision. There's so many different ways that you could slice the pie up. I haven't figured out one that I appreciate more than another, or think is more helpful than another.
I want to come back on the tyranny piece, because you had a good T.Rex Talk podcast about it recently. I want to ask you about. I think you identified something interesting, which I am sympathetic to, which is the idea that this gun culture 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 story kind of starts in the middle of the story and posits gun culture 1.0, the hunting, FUD, quote unquote, culture, as kind of the beginning. but
Yeah,
it starts in the middle of the 20th century and ignores, among other things, the founding era. There's this like gun
that's
culture
true. Yeah,
0.1,
and
where I think
the
this
fact
idea of
that
like guns as weapons wasn't even questioned because it was just taken for granted.
right. Yeah, and even before that, the idea of who can own weapons, even before firearms were the dominant weapon. Like 500 years ago, this conversation about, uh, within the political philosophy that was, coming out of feudalism, and you start to have the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and people are coming out of feudalism and asking this question of like, who's in charge and where do they get their authority and who gets to actually control the means of force. All of these conversations are really the same way back then as they are once there are firearms. Firearms are just a better distillation of the tools because prior to gunpowder, having significant military or fighting capability is expensive, requires a huge amount of training and time, but firearms are just a tremendous equalizer. Now we can have a debate that really focuses on the technology. And that's part of the reason that I think it is so easy in the gun control debate to focus on specific firearm features and lose sight of the larger philosophical arguments of who is allowed to defend themselves and at what level and what's proportional. And then the bigger discussion is, well, I'm allowed to defend myself against someone who's trying to take my life, who's another random guy like me, but what about tyrannical governments that overstep their bounds? And what are the bounds? So we're talking about philosophical conversations that go back thousands of years when you really start to open this can of worms. And the big question is, says who? That's that is the really big question at the end of it. Who's the boss? Says who?
Yeah. So you did an episode of the T.Rex Talk podcast recently about this question of, gun ownership as, decentralized tyranny prevention. And I had written an episode of the OSD newsletter, an edition of the OSD newsletter called "The Tyranny is Here, It's Just Not Evenly Distributed." So the idea is
that was fantastic, by the way. Yeah.
Thanks. The idea is, you hear a lot about, okay, well, we have guns to prevent the government from tyrannizing us, which is like, great. Let's prevent that. And you can point to examples from U.S. history where guns were used successfully in that way. Probably, I guess, the civil rights era would be the most famous one, but there are a lot. But you can also point to examples where tyranny was not prevented by gun ownership.
For certain, yeah.
You can point to, like, the example I gave in the newsletter was the raid on the guy who I think he was like an executive at the airport in Little Rock. He was raided for
Brian Malinowski. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He was raided by the ATF and killed in that raid when he defended himself against, unknown people breaking into his house at 6 a.m. For ATF paperwork violations. He was allegedly selling guns without an FFL. And that's, a fairly niche example. The spicy example I gave in the newsletter was the income tax. In a world where the income tax didn't exist, if somebody proposed it, not gradually rolling in, but if somebody proposed like, hey, you're taxed 0% today, and tomorrow we're going to take a third of every cent you make, I think that would be regarded as tyranny.
Yeah.
I am curious for your... So I think there is some sort of like underlying mechanism here for like, what is the structure of the system that causes guns to successfully prevent tyranny in some cases and to not prevent it in others? And there is sort of a like underlying structure there that I think we gloss over when we say like, oh, guns prevent tyranny. That's too simplistic. what's your best guess at like what is that underlying structure?
It really comes down to the will and actions of the people. It's like people often talk about the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Second Amendment, and they say like, well, it says not to do tyranny, but obviously it was a bad document because it didn't work because we have tyranny now. It's like, well, that's kind of like saying a stop sign didn't work because the person didn't stop. I think that the laws are the same way. The piece of paper did not stop the government from building a very large IRS to implement an income tax, even though I think that the paper should have told the people that it's their responsibility to stop the government from doing that. Firearms are the same way, but obviously a firearm is a much more tangible obstacle than just a piece of paper. The big thing that I think that firearms are helpful for, obviously they are weapons and they apply force directly when you use them as weapons. But there's also a very important aspect to the firearms themselves, which is the conversation that happens when firearms are taken away is a very different conversation. So Henry Chan over at Nine Hole Reviews, and I've had this conversation offline. We should really turn it into a podcast, but he grew up in Singapore, and in Singapore, or in Hong Kong rather. Yes, this is true in Singapore as well. But in Hong Kong, there are no privately owned firearms. And so the conversation about firearm ownership is basically non-existent. But that also means that the thought that you have any ability to tell the government not to do anything is non-existent. The rights that you have as an individual are something that you just think about incredibly differently. If you take something that is as dangerous, as lethal as a AR-15 rifle, and you say that people are allowed to have this and the government is not allowed to take it away from them, it sets into place a cultural and philosophical framework for thinking about your other rights and for thinking about whether or not you should be taxed for this or whether or not you should be taxed for that, or whether or not you're allowed to own land or whether or not you're allowed to own other types of property. So just having it as a cultural touchstone is huge, even if it never actually gets used in combat. And we can see this happening around the ghost gun debate, where the government is saying, yes, fine, you're allowed to own guns, but you're not allowed to own any gun parts or the things that you would use to make guns. You're not allowed to innovate around guns. You're not allowed to invent new manufacturing technologies around guns. And people are saying, really? You're not allowed to own information about how guns are made. Really? The fact that we're allowed to own the gun that kills the people is a great arguing point from. We're not allowed to own the machine that makes the springs, but we're allowed to own the gun that shoots the people. I think that it is a tremendous bulwark, an anchor in the ground for us to talk about rights and to talk about tyranny about, as well as being that physical obstacle. The fact that there are hundreds of millions of guns in the country, I think has significant value. But the fact that we can still have this conversation about, I am allowed to have this gun, this piece of paper from a long time ago that the New York Times or the Atlantic says is deeply problematic, is still the law of the land. And we still want to abide by these laws in this way. Having a physical object, I think, is a really helpful way to not allow that conversation to just be completely defined into nothingness, the way that a lot of conversations have been in the 21st century.
I really like that. So it's this idea of guns as like a kind of public signal that you being dangerous is a pro-social act, not an anti-social act.
Exactly. Yeah. And to point out the ludicrous nature of some of the arguments, like, I'm allowed to have a thing that kills people, but I can't have a book that has pictures of the thing that kills people in it. I'm not allowed to have a 3D model of the physical object that I have. I hope that people think logically about some of these things as we, continue to debate for these rights.
You're not allowed to advertise the thing that kills people, but you're allowed to, to own it.
Yeah. It's a fascinating conversation to have. And the goal, I would say that we have as a company at T.Rex, I mean, the goal of all of us should be, we have these tools to preserve life in life-threatening situations. but we also want to avoid those life-threatening situations as much as possible. So I have firearms as a last resort, and then I have a whole bunch of things that I want to do before then. And that's true on the individual case. Like I have locks on my doors. You know, I haven't made it real easy for robbers to get into my house so that I can shoot them. No, there's other steps before the lethal force comes into play. And that's the case on the Second Amendment front as well. We don't trick politicians into making bad policies so that we can go shoot them. There need to be these steps. There needs to be these obstacles to tyranny. There needs to be a preservation of freedom that happens. And then what happened in 1776 is the last resort. And that's what our founders made very clear. They have remonstrated. They have made their case before the crown. They have done all these things. They've done all the steps that are necessary. And now they're actually being invaded by the crown. That's when the shooting war starts. And the shooting war was painful. It was difficult. Lots of people lost their lives. It was incredibly damaging to both countries. And avoiding that at all costs until you can't avoid it any longer is the right, correct, noble, moral thing to do. But the fact that the colonists had the firearms to actually push back gave them a much better shot at, there's a much better chance, even though it didn't happen, there's a much better chance, I think, that all of their appeals to Parliament and to the Crown were even listened to a little bit is because that they were armed and had the capability to govern themselves. Ultimately, Parliament decided that it was worth just sending in the redcoats. But that happened after years and years of appeal and court cases and conversations, as opposed to just being run over in the early 1700s.
Yeah.
I do think it's unhelpful when we talk about the Second Amendment and we only talk about the shooting war that happened from April of 1775 until the early 1780s. The decades before were incredibly important. The fact that there were a bunch of flintlocks in the colonies is not why America became a free country. It was the people who were here, and it was the ideas that they had. It was the Constitutional Convention that already existed. All those people were elected officials who were passing laws for their colonies already. They were already a self-governing people who understood what their rights and responsibilities were. That is why America became a free country. The fact that we had enough flintlocks and some cannons is the reason we stayed a free country.
Thinking about the future of gun culture, the COVID era was kind of a watershed, right? So gun ownership shot way up. I did the math on this. I estimated 1 in 8 gun owners became a gun owner in 2020. 1 in 8 gun owners in the U.S. today. Yeah. And in some ways it was kind of an inflection point, and in others it was not. So I think certain things just hit escape velocity and are not coming back, right? So like ARs, red dots, like those have, hit escape velocity. They are on their way out of the solar system. I think there are others though and I'm thinking of things like body armor, radios, night vision, where they've been in this kind of like prosumer like space for a while. And they've been in a space where I would have guessed like, okay, these things are ready to hit the big time and they just need some catalyzing event. And if anything was going to be that catalyst, it would have been COVID. And they haven't taken off to the same extent. So I am curious, A, if you even agree with that analysis, and B, if you do, why you think they didn't take off yet in the same way, and maybe you don't agree, and I'm curious to hear that.
Well, as far as T-Rex is concerned, body armor did take off in 2020. But it wasn't the lockdowns. It was the riots that happened in the summer. It was really interesting to see. And a lot of it, I think, is just body armor is a weird product. You understand what it's used for in war and in combat, but you don't really need any in your own closet. But then a bunch of people watched footage of the riots and they're like, oh, So that's what it's for. And then they were like, oh, I'm watching people getting shot in front of their houses. You know what? $500 to be bulletproof is actually really cheap. So we saw pretty significant body armor sales, but I do agree with you that it's not widespread. It's not a thing that every gun owner has decided is a thing that he needs to own. And at T-Rex, we've kind of split our customer base into sort of 4 groups, where we have our everyday carry guy. You know, we have someone who has just bought their firearm. That's like level, I forget if we're calling it level 0 or level 1 right now. We've had this conversation several times. But you have just bought a gun because 2020 happened. And whether you were offended by the lockdowns, or you were worried by the riots, or you were, for whatever reason, you bought a gun. The next step up is you become someone who carries that gun. That requires that you buy a holster. It requires that ideally it requires that you do some training, but you've done enough thinking about this issue that you're carrying the gun. And then from there, maybe you make the next step to you buy some extra equipment. You now make the jump to you are a rifle owner, and you practice with the rifle, and you want some equipment to carry magazines with. And that's kind of like your, I'm trying to think of some of the different words or different phrases we use to describe these different levels. But the final level is the Minuteman. The Minuteman is a guy who is that quick reaction force like you saw in 1775. So this is a guy who is not just owning the stuff, but he actually understands a little bit about how to use it. And he has some of the other accessories. So not only can he carry his rifle, but he also can carry some extra magazines, and he has body armor, and maybe he has night vision. And this sort of Minuteman level, this is almost like the special forces of the unorganized militia. They're the most organized. They actually train together, and they actually have this higher level equipment. And not everybody needs to be that. In fact, I got to tell you right now, with 5 kids and heading into my mid 40s, my light infantry days of being a quick reaction force for my neighborhood are I am no longer the tip of the spear, shall we say. I have dropped back to that regular infantry guy where I have the basics, and I don't make the most of the fanciest gear. And so that's the kind of thing where I think there are these different tiers, and I don't really expect night vision to be in everybody's hands. It's certainly not in everybody's budget. But certain things like being able to have a rifle, being able to have rifle magazines, an optic that you have zeroed, these things are within everybody's grasp. And even your lowest level, kind of like home guard type activity, the stuff that not that long ago, like in the 1940s in the UK, the home guard was people who were too old to be real soldiers or too young to be real soldiers, but they were expected to be, we'll hand this guy a Sten gun and a bunch of ammo, and he'll go out and carry this stuff and keep an eye out for German paratroopers and be ready to shoot at them. Like that's a bar where having the rifle and the mags can totally be met. And night vision, body armor, suppressors, stuff like this that is super cool and really useful in the hands of that higher level guy. Maybe everybody doesn't actually need that. It's very fun to play with. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Yeah, it is. Another thing kind of in that category is 3D printed weapons, not in the same kind of mass market sense, but in this like emerging weapons technology space. It's, to me, it's actually similar to crypto. I think the development mirrors crypto in that they've both been around a while, and I think you could critique them on the one hand of like, okay, it's been like 1 year away from some kind of breakthrough application for 10 plus years. And on the other hand, I think you'd have to say anything that's around for 10 or 15 years and doesn't die is kind of, by that fact alone, valuable to somebody.
Yeah.
What do you think is like, where does 3D printing of weapons settle? Is it that there is going to be a breakthrough application? Is it something else? Like, what does this look like in 10 years?
That's a great question. I really like the analogy, 3D printed guns and Bitcoin, because I can definitely see the spectrum of gun owners where the sort of the new, less freedom-minded gun owners are like, oh, really don't like 3D printed guns because it's going to make the gun control people mad, and I'm going to get negatively affected somehow with the new regulations. And then there's also really hardcore gun guys who are like, I don't like 3D printed guns because it's an inferior plastic, and I don't want people messing around with these inferior guns, So, and we saw that with Bitcoin too, where there were like hardcore bullion guys who are like, I don't like, I hate them Federal Reserve notes, but I don't want to mess with no ones and zeros. Like people who should have been allies to this technology had, on opposite ends of the spectrum, had different reasons to distrust it. But it's been around for a long time now. 3D printed guns are only getting better. They're partly getting better because 3D printing technology is getting better, but also the ways that the designers are thinking about additive manufacturing, leaning into its strengths have gotten way better. So I think it's an incredibly cool space, but I don't know where it actually ends up. Does it hang out in a space where, like T.Rex Arms, we use additive manufacturing heavily for prototyping stuff. We're not prototyping guns, but we're prototyping all sorts of stuff that we injection mold, or stuff that we're going to injection mold, or just tinkering with different designs of things, and being able to do that in-house, that rapid prototyping in-house speeds up development cycles of all kinds of things. And we sell some stuff from 100 Concepts that is final, not prototypes, but like final production parts that are 3D printed because they're low volume and they're highly customized. And the strength is there with the nylon printers. So I think that it probably just becomes a really key part of firearm innovation and development. And it becomes a really key part of some of the low volume stuff. Like I see a lot of room for 3D printed night vision parts because there's just not enough people to justify a lot of development in that space with mass-produced stuff. So it may still exist in the fringes, but as long as it exists in the fringes, it's going to be a great talking point. It's going to be a great conversation starter. One of the things that I think is really disappointing about 3D printed guns is that they are so scary that YouTube specifically, and other people just kind of generally, like have made 3D printed guns such a boogeyman that regular additive manufacturing content is kind of squashed. And there are guys on YouTube. Oh, I forget his name now. Oh, I can't believe I forgot his name. There's a 3D printer guy on YouTube, and he had hundreds of videos on generic 3D printers and filaments and tools and developments. And then he did a video on 3D printed guns and lost his channel. So there is a fear around 3D printed guns that I think has given a stigma to additive manufacturing, which is a real shame.
That sucks.
Yeah, because 3D printing is so cool. And in some ways, it's so cool for a lot of things that aren't guns. Like it's almost hard to make guns work with some of these filaments, and it's so useful for other stuff that it's a shame that the media has really glommed onto this. And the tech media, not so much. I think the tech media is much better understanding like this is a future manufacturing technology and rapid prototyping is cool, but kind of the legacy media. If you look up 3D printed or 3D printers on like legacy media sites, it's very likely talking about ghost guns and not talking about a cool new filament or a cool new rapid prototyping technique.
Yeah.
Kind of non-surprisingly.
Yeah. I think it's funny how this stuff is often, it's an artifact of when the mainstream media happens to find out about the thing. And if they find out about it too late, the cat's already out of the bag. But if they find out about it early, it's early enough to kind of kill it in its infancy. And maybe 3D printing, it's still TBD which side of that line it's going to fall on.
Well, and it does a very interesting thing, which is There is, I just forgot the name of this too. There's a pretty large 3D printing trade show. There's probably a number of them. There are a bunch of T-Rex guys went to a couple of months ago, and these are companies. Some of them are tech companies, but a lot of them are manufacturing companies that lean really a lot farther conservative than you would think. And I believe that a big part of it for some specific companies that I can think of, I won't exactly name, is they're seeing this very unfair treatment of a specific manufacturing technology because of ghost guns. And it's just kind of pushed them to be a little more like they're already an uncool conservative themed technology now. So why not just lean into branding themselves as a defense positive company?
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting trend that may result in this treatment.
That is interesting. Yeah, maybe that's kind of a natural counterbalance.
Yeah.
Hopefully. One thing I wanted to ask you about is you just on the topic of kind of product innovation, innovating cheaply. You did a T.Rex Labs video a while ago about how the most innovative thing in the original Glock design was the slide stop. And the premise was, someone might say like, well, what's so innovative about the slide stop? It's this stupid, super cheap piece of stamped sheet metal. And you would say, exactly, it's a super cheap piece of stamped sheet metal. And the innovation was that it can be that. And the frame can be made out of plastic where the dimensions don't matter all that much. And the thing still works. And that's the major innovation. Because, before that, like slide stops were these like delicately, precisely machined pieces of steel. So like handguns went through that transformation. Everything is a Glock now. What is ripe for that same kind of disruption? Like what is kind of gated on being too boutique, too precious, too kind of handmade that doesn't need to be anymore?
Well, an obvious one is night vision. Night vision for decades, almost a century, because the cathode tube is, I believe, a century old now. But the night vision analog image intensifier tubes are decades old, and technology really hasn't changed that much in decades. There's been, newer, more exotic materials for doping the crystals and all sorts of extremely esoteric stuff to just squeeze more performance out of these tubes. I do think that that's an area where as soon as the CMOS sensors of just regular cameras get sensitive enough in the dark, that's an area that gets overturned real quickly. Or when thermal cameras get cheaper, if you right now a cheap thermal camera is so inferior to an expensive one, and cheap digital night vision, or I would say even good digital night vision, the Opsin from Psionics, is inferior to Gen 3 analog night vision. But if you were to mix together inferior digital night vision and a really cheap thermal camera, you would get something that is superior, is greater than the sum of its parts. That's the sort of thing that I think you lean into. The strengths of these two digital sensors and their strengths combined are more than the weaknesses make them more valuable. I think there's some things like that may come. I'm primarily thinking in the digital space right now, just because of some projects that I'm working on for mapping and for optics. But there are a few bits and pieces. I talked about this a little bit when I reviewed the Opsin, but I see folks in Silicon Valley working on virtual reality headsets and augmented reality headsets that need a really high level of color fidelity and resolution and sharpness. And that is really hard to attain in small electronics. But I would love to have, for outdoor purposes, land navigation purposes, I would love to have an augmented reality display that is low resolution and monochrome and accurate. I could use that for all kinds of land navigation and mapping stuff. And I feel like we could do some experimentation with the cheap stuff and find the strengths of some of these different user interfaces if we just kind of leaned into them. So there's a few things like that. There's some radio stuff, some optical stuff, and maybe some mapping stuff to where there is room to leapfrog the expensive military stuff. The reason why this may not happen is these are kind of niche things, sort of like night vision is now. The market may not really be there. It could be that the market is small, not so much because these things are expensive, but just because the interest isn't there at any price. But these are areas where I feel like the technology is particularly stagnant, and a new approach with newer technology or just a little bit more sensitive silicon sensor would let us lean into something that is 10 times cheaper and twice as good and opens up a whole new, thermal fusion capability. And it will be a bit like the Glock days where people are like, oh, having this tolerance here lets us cut prices by 90%. Oh, suddenly it's a good idea. I will say for your listeners, the guy who clued me into that, there's a YouTube channel called AVE. He's a Canadian engineer, and his walkthrough of the Glock 19 is fascinating because he goes through all the parts and explains why they are the way that they are, and why they are more than the sum of their parts. And even though they are all technically inferior to the other way of making firearms, together they make a superior product that is also cheaper.
Cool. I haven't seen that one. Have you seen his review of the Juicero juicer?
Yes, that was my introduction to him. Okay. And that was when I became a fan. Yeah.
That's the opposite, where everything is way more expensive than it needs to be.
Yeah. Shockingly overbuilt and underdesigned. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, let's end with just like a little rapid fire. I will name a couple. I'll name like 3 technologies, and you tell me where you think they're going to be in 5 years. What interesting things are going to happen in the next 5 years?
Okay, this is tricky.
And then we'll do another episode in 5 years and score you.
Yeah, in 5 years we'll find out what a bad predictor.
PDWs.
PDWs are very fun. They'll still be around in 5 years. I predict they'll actually look like the Uzi in 5 years.
Cool. Okay. I hope you're right.
Kind of go old school again. Yeah.
Yeah. I like it. Silencers.
If we get a little bit of loosened regulation, silencers will be awesome in 5 years. They will be cheap enough that people will really innovate and experiment with stuff like wipes. Otherwise, they'll be 10% better than they are now and 10% cheaper.
And last one.
Still be good.
Fire-by-wire.
Fire-by-wire is tricky because there's few things that I want to play with as much as fire-by-wire, but I can't imagine myself ever fully trusting it. So I see fire-by-wire, if we can, again, get past some ATF regulation stuff, fire-by-wire will be the only way that competition shooters actually shoot, but it won't be something that is inside duty weapons. But it will completely and utterly take over the competition scene in everything from PRS to pistol matches, like no question.
Cool.
I said that with a lot more boldness than I actually feel, by the way.
I admire the confidence, even if it's false.
Yeah.
Where can people go to stay up to date on what you're doing?
So T.Rex Arms, TREX-arms.com is the main website. But you can also find us on YouTube. So we have just moved our podcast over to YouTube. So at this point, I think all of our media is on YouTube. Now, by the time this episode comes out, I'm not sure if that will still be true. But if you look up T.Rex Arms on YouTube, you can find T.Rex Arms, the main channel, T.Rex Armory, which is product reviews, T.Rex Labs, which is R&D, and now T.Rex Talk, which is our podcast. And if you like this podcast you just listened to, I think the T-Rex Talk podcast is pretty similar, especially since Kareem, I want to invite you onto our podcast because I want to have a conversation with you about your side of basically all the same questions that we just went through.
Anytime. All right, Isaac Botkin, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate what you're doing, and really glad to have this conversation.
Thank you.